Every few months, a new TikTok goes viral that claims that kids today just can't read.
A lot of these kids don't know how to read because they have had things read to them, or they can click a button and have something read out loud to them. I just don't think these kids even care.
Teachers are alarmed and frustrated, parents panic, and the comment section is of course brutal. The reasoning for this that everybody seems to just gravitate to is the use of screen time. And while it is true that screen time does negatively affect Generation Alpha's behavioral problems, it's not necessarily the cause and effect when it comes to their literacy. Because here's something that you probably don't know, is that Generation Alpha actually reads the most words per day of any generation ever in the entirety of human history. Now, let me tell you, when I found that out, I was simply agog, because you might think that exposure to words actually results in somebody being more literate, but this is really the important distinction when it comes to actually perceiving something with your senses versus understanding the word and the context behind it. See, Generation Alpha isn't reading words in the context of a novel or a script the way we typically read, but instead they're reading words through prompts, through messages, through captions, instructions. They are literally immersed in words constantly. If exposure to words alone was responsible for literacy, then these kids would actually be the most well-read, articulate, and astute children to ever exist. So clearly something is not adding up, and in my experience, when things don't add up simply, it's oftentimes because we're asking the wrong question. So maybe the question isn't why can't kids read today, but rather a better question would be what structural changes happened to the American school system and Canadian, for my Canadians out there, that resulted in this decline of literacy. Because what's happening today is not a natural decline of literacy. It is a predictable outcome of a system that has made very specific choices, quietly, gradually, and with good intentions, but now are shocked at their results. So today we are going to get into the changes when it comes to general education in the Western nations and how that has resulted in these rapid decline of literacy. Now, before we jump into it, I just want to say I'm actually recovering from laryngitis. I'm very, very sick. So to all my new viewers out there who, may think that I'm quite nasally, I promise I'm not this nasally ordinarily. I'm very, very sick right now. My apologies in advance. So get a snack if you've got laryngitis, get some tea, and let's get into it. For modern education, reading was actually quite simple. You would just read the entirety of a book. Then that could be a novel, a script, a biography, whatever, but you would read the entirety of that body of work. Reading the entirety of the book is actually really important because your brain has a chance to stick with it long enough. Often when we read, especially when we're reading challenging books, say for example, if you're reading a Shakespearean script or if you're reading 1800 literature, your brain actually has to struggle to adapt to this different way of talking, a way that is unnatural to us now. You learn a lot of new and antiquated vocabulary that you wouldn't have otherwise heard, not because you're looking up those words, but you're learning it through the context of the passage. And you also have to learn how that meaning unfolds over time. Say for example, if something is being said sarcastically, you can't literally take that word at its face value. It wouldn't make sense in the context of the passage. And that really is how you grow as a reader, is when you immerse yourself in an area that is challenging, when you have to struggle through the language and actually to adapt. That is how your brain reaps the cognitive benefits of reading. A really big component of literacy isn't knowing how to read, as in memorizing the words and knowing their meaning as Gen Alpha does, but it's actually having the stamina to continue to read when the reading stops being easy. Especially, and not to harp on it, but when you start reading books that are from a different era, you have to essentially relearn the context of these words, and you don't get that when you memorize words and you're just seeing it on subtitles or captions on TikTok. However, sometime in the 1990s, the American school systems actually did a structural change. This wasn't something that they necessarily announced or held any sort of press conference to unveil this new structure, but rather it was a subtle pivot. Instead of reading books entirely, children were instead to read only passages of books. This is something I actually felt myself, as in middle school, we would read books entirely, and then in high school, we switched to reading just passages. School started focusing less on the quality of the content and more on the quantity of the books we read. So instead of reading a couple of books over a course of a semester, we would read many short stories, related passages, text-style passages, and informational snippets. Now you might be wondering, why did they do this? Well, switching from long form books to a short passage, especially test style packages, was more efficient. They wanted us to have higher metrics and higher test scores, and so they thought that this would be the best way to prime us to be good test takers. The goal of education shifted from learning and knowledge to one of metrics and benchmarks. Passages are efficient because they fit neatly into a 45-minute period. They're easy to standardize and easier to assess. Oftentimes you need weeks to actually read the book and understand its content and the meaning that the author is trying to convey. Books actually resist the semester schedules that teachers have, and they don't provide quick data points to assess children with. Once efficiency and benchmarks became the priority of the education system, books just became a liability.
7th grade English teacher here. I teach in Northern Houston, and I teach at one of the more affluent schools. That these babies cannot read, they cannot write, and they cannot comprehend. I'm not being funny.
So while schools didn't actively discourage reading, they did fragment it. Now, as I mentioned, I was in the education system when we did have this kind of transitional period. And so I can definitely speak from experience. I feel like the short passages that I read, first of all, I can't remember any of them. None of them resonated with me. So I feel like that should tell you something right away. But I definitely did not get the same meaning from them as I did when I read a book and really enjoyed it. I couldn't tell you any of the short passages I read, even in university. And I'm literally in university right now, so I should remember. But I can definitely tell you all about Streetcar Named Desire, and I read that in 10th grade, more than 10 years ago now. And that really does speak to the object permanence when it comes to just sitting with a literary piece and truly understanding it and resonating with the emotion that the author is trying to convey to you. And that is just simply not something that you can get in a fragmented 45-minute period. There's another really big unintended consequence when it comes to not reading full books, and that's something that I don't really see anybody talking about. Despite the lack of awareness, this is something that everybody is feeling, and that is a lack of empathy. Reading, especially long-form fiction, actually does something to the human brain. When you read a novel, you're not only just perceiving the words on the page, but rather you're inhibiting the mind of the author or of the character. And this is really important and something that you can never experience in the real world, and that is that you're sitting with somebody's experiences or thoughts long enough for you to actually understand them. You experience their motivations and backstories that you personally don't hold, but you grasp an understanding for somebody else's. And that's why when you're reading a book where the main character is a villain or does something unethical, you are still rooting for them because you understand that their character and their identity is way more than that one unsavory instance. Reading long form anything allows you to experience an emotional arc without any sort of shortcuts, and more importantly, you do this without being asked to judge. There's no comment section in a book or an algorithm rewarding any sort of outrage. You can experience the character and the story independently of anybody else's thoughts or feelings, meaning you get to form your own opinion, and oftentimes that opinion is one that is nuanced and it doesn't just, look at the character black and white. A growing body of psychological and neuroscience research has shown that frequent engagement with narrative fiction is actually associated with higher levels of empathy, perspective taking, emotional regulation, and theory of mind. And it's not because people that read books are morally superior by any means, but it's actually because they train the skill of understanding somebody else without immediately jumping to a reaction or to the comment section. This is a really unique skill because, as I mentioned, you will literally never be able to actually inhibit somebody else's mind. Reading is literally the closest way to do so. And this really is not something that can be done in any sort of fragmented short form passage because you're not able to connect with the character the way you are when you're reading a book or a series in a book. Skimming informational text doesn't ask you to hold contradictory emotions at once. Test style reading doesn't reward patience or compassion, it actually rewards extraction. When we replace books with test ready passages, we didn't just dilute the child's stamina for reading, but we also removed an opportunity for children to learn how to empathize with other people in a really meaningful way. Empathy is actually not instinctual. Though we are social creatures, ultimately we care about our survival above anything else. Empathy is rather like a muscle, and if you don't use it, eventually it's going to atrophy. So if you grow up in an environment where stories are shortened, characters are decontextualized, and reading is rushed, you don't lose the capacity for empathy, you lose the training. So you become faster at reading the words at the page and actually perceiving them, but you become worse at understanding and sitting with the content itself. I really do think that this speaks to Generation Alpha's behavioral problems. I mean, we've all seen these TikToks of them acting crazy in the classroom. But we see the impatience, the polarization, the instinct to flatten people into labels instead of histories, and honestly, just the straight up disrespect that they seem to treat everybody with.
This not what I wanted? Oh.
It's not necessarily that they're colder or meaner just by instinct, but rather because the system that is supposed to raise them is failing them. Now, this general topic was actually inspired by a new podcast that I found out called Old School with Charlotte Brooks. As I'm sure you can surmise from my following, I'm definitely not sponsored by this. This is just a genuine recommendation comprehension. I thought it was a really interesting podcast. But essentially, he is on a explicit mission around combating the decline in sustained reading and literacy engagement. He argues that fewer people, especially younger generations, are actually reading for pleasure or for any sort of emotional or intellectual depth. He believes that enduring literature actually helps sharpen thinking, strengthen character, and foster deeper understanding. In his podcast, he actually dissects famous literature like Old Men of the Sea. He recently did a really good one, which was about why people aren't taking the piss with Richard Dawkins. And he talks about the meaning and depth of each work. So if you're interested in reading, but maybe you don't necessarily have the time to, and you can't afford Audible like myself, I would really recommend it. It's on Spotify, it's free, might be something you're interested in. Now, in addition to this kind of fragmented reading that schools actually encouraged and bolstered, the instruction on reading something changed significantly. In an effort to increase the school's own benchmarks and metrics, they started instructing students to identify the main idea, find textual evidence, infer meaning, or analyze the author's purpose. And while these are not inherently bad skills in and of themselves, I think they are very useful for dissecting and interpreting texts. Ultimately, these strategies do not create readers, only reading creates readers. I think also, in my experience at least, this kind of hyperfixation on these instructions really took away from the meaning of the book or the passage. What our quote-unquote tactic was that our teacher would implore us to do would be to read the question, go to the passage, and highlight the relevant points of the passage. Oftentimes, especially on a test situation, I wouldn't actually even read the passage, nor would any of my peers, because that's not what we were instructed to do. We were supposed to have the highest grades, and that was the most efficient way to get the highest grades. It didn't even involve reading the passage itself. I'm sure that allowed students to participate in discussion or answer comprehensive questions. Ultimately, these same students struggle to read a chapter in one go. This comes back to what I was speaking about earlier when it comes to actually perceiving the words on the paper versus actually understanding it. We're essentially demonstrating that we can be literate, but we're not actually practicing being literate. Does that make sense? Now, of course, no school or teacher was acting maliciously when these structural changes were sought into place. Rather, they were just incentivized to increase their test scores. The largest incentive being standardized testing. Tests don't measure deep reading, they measure short passages under timed pressure. So instruction followed assessment. So teachers were best preparing students for taking the test, and they did that. They did a really good job of that. However, unfortunately, taking tests is not a real world applicable skill, but reading and being able to sit with content for a long time without fatigue or empathizing with characters are real world skills that every student should know. There's also the time pressure, especially in North America and definitely in Canada. Our schools are very overcrowded and we just don't have enough teacher or curriculum to support the amount of students there. With our current model of evaluating a student, and of course you do have to evaluate a student to make sure that they're understanding the material and meeting their learning objectives, but when your class sizes go from 15 to 30, you do not have the time to thoroughly investigate every single student to make sure that they are understanding the material. And unfortunately, that meant that reading is the first thing to go because it takes the most amount of time. Taking a Scantron test is going to be way easier to mark than it is to mark 30 individual essays that could vary from 10 to 12 pages per essay. And I also believe that another incentive or pressure on the staff was in response to equity concerns. Educators worried that long books disadvantaged struggling readers, but instead of giving those students more support because they don't have the support, the system just gave them less reading, which obviously worsen the gap. That's essentially like saying, to reduce teen pregnancy, we're just not going to test any teens for pregnancy. It doesn't actually solve the problem itself. It is just going to worsen the problem. So let's fast forward to right now to see what the teachers are reporting when it comes to Gen Alpha. Teachers across the country report the same pattern, that students avoid long text, that their vocabulary is shallow, and I oftentimes see teachers saying that they literally cannot read, which is deeply concerning. And the National Reading Assessment scores follow. There is a genuine decline in literacy. The scores didn't fall because the kids themselves are worse or they're the problem, or even that the teachers are not trying as hard, because they definitely are trying hard. Fell because the system stopped asking kids to do the thing that builds literacy. Unfortunately, the school system as an institution just no longer prioritizes reading. So I'm sure you can see now why I really do take issue when people just automatically jump to screen time causing issues with children's literacy. And trust me, I'm anti-screen time when it comes to children. I don't think it is the culprit here. When children can't read comfortably, associate reading with stress or lack narrative stamina, screens become the obvious alternative. But here's the point that I think a lot of people miss: when children do read for pleasure and outside, the negative effects of screen time is actually mitigated. And of course, outside of school, the story kind of stays the same. When reading is treated as laborious or as a task that needs to be completed by a school institution, children will perceive it the same way outside of school. And children read less outside of school, not because stories are bad, but because they're just genuinely not interested. They don't perceive it as fun. I don't know about you guys, but I was super into reading when I was a kid. I seriously would stay up all night reading Thea Stilton. Any of my Thea Stilton fans, go crazy in the comments. I want to hear your favorite story. I genuinely thought reading was so fun as a kid. I absolutely loved it. It was my favorite thing to do. And the sensation of walking into an indigo over chapters and being able to pick a book was my favorite feeling ever. I was so excited to go into that store. And that is something that inadvertently we have robbed children of. I think reading is so powerful, especially for kids, when it comes to forming their own identity. And if they don't perceive it as fun, they're not going to do it. And it's also really hard to compete against TikToks or these hyper stimulating devices. And when the only reading that they do in school is heavily annotated, evaluated, and grading, reading stops becoming voluntary. And once it loses the pleasure, it loses the frequency entirely. So the answer isn't simply to encourage them to read more, because no encouragement is going to make something laborious fun, but rather it's to redefine reading entirely. The only way to do that is through the experience of actually reading a book. Ultimately, it is these systems that change people's behaviors more than any sort of individual ever could. The onus is not on the parents or the teachers themselves, it is on the school districts and the standard setters. Children adapt to literally whatever is required of them. And for years, the American schools required less reading, shorter text, faster completion, and more performance. And suddenly, everybody is surprised by the outcome. This is not a Generation Alpha problem, it is an adult problem. If you are a parent, or maybe Generation Alpha, definitely not, because you are not part of my audience. But if you are and you want to get more into reading, or to prime your child for being interested and curious about reading, this next part's for you. Like I said, the only way to get somebody into reading is to actually read a book. Depending on the age group of your child or of yourself, of course, that is going to depend what kind of book you're interested in. Something that my mom did that always really stuck with me, and I really am grateful that she did now, is that she would always read me a book before bed. And I'm not talking about a just genuine storybook. No, we would do chapter books, like thick chapter books, and we would read them over the course of months. And every night she would sit and do the voices of like 20 some pages, and that would get me really interested in reading. And you might be hearing chapter books and thinking, Ruth, how old were you? We would do this probably until I was 14. Like, it was kind of our thing. Also, on another note of being a good mother, I actually witnessed this as I was serving somebody at a sushi restaurant. This mother came in with her family and she had these two boys. They were about 12 or 14. So I'm sure you can imagine that age group, they'd be quite rowdy. In fact, that was not the case. She was literally reading a book at the table and everybody was quiet and just immersed in the story that she was saying. And I just thought, wow, what a good mom. Like, she's bringing that book everywhere she goes, and she's using these quiet moments to connect with her family and also to instill the importance of literacy with her children. These boys, like these, high energy boys, were totally enamored by the story that they were listening to. So maybe that's something that you want to include with your family time. I think this is a really good way to connect with your children and also to expose them to really meaningful pieces of literature. So something that I do myself is to carry a book with me everywhere I go. And I do this not because I'm a performative male, but actually because there's so much downtime in the day, and oftentimes we just go on our phone and we're just scrolling on Instagram or on TikTok or anything, and that time is wasted when actually we could be, reading something over a longer term. So when I have downtimes in the day, as inevitably we all do, or I'm waiting in line or something like that, I can just take out my book and read a couple pages, and that increases the stamina when it comes to reading, even though it's only for a short period of time. I think by having that alternative as opposed to just, going on your phone and scrolling ad nauseum, one's obviously better. So that's it for Ruth's quick tips on reading. Unfortunately, it is not an extensive list, but that is really the only way to get interested in reading, is to actually read. Unfortunately, there's no shortcuts around it. We didn't lose literacy by accident. We lost it because we reassigned the education system at large to prioritize outcomes as opposed to actual learning. We traded depth for coverage, experience for extractions, and books for passages. We cannot blame Generation Alpha because they are not at fault here. They have adapted perfectly in an environment that we set out for them. The responsibility for this lapse is on the standard setters. Unless we are willing to to admit what we changed is not working and even more willing to undo it, nothing is going to change. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate if you've made it to the end. Seriously, it means the world to me to have your attention. If you like this video, of course, please like and comment and tell me your thoughts on this crisis. And also give me some book recommendations because my Goodreads is looking very dire right now and I would love to expand my horizons here. Again, I'm so sorry for my nasally voice. Like I can hear it and I'm just like, ah, but I am seriously so sick. Like I've just been completely dead to the world. This is actually the first time this week I've been vertical and I'm not kidding. Like I've been in bed literally all week, just so sick. If you've watched to this part of the video, you might as well subscribe. I mean, at this point, like we're already there. What are we doing here? Let's have this relationship have a little bit more commitment, okay? Hit that little red button. And as always, I will see you in the next one.